I don't take orders from people like you. The words cut through the lobby of the Bellevue Regency like a blade. Crystal glasses trembled, and for a heartbeat even the jazz band in the corner seemed to falter. In that single moment, Zariah Monroe realized she had just become visible to the very people who had ignored her all night. This is not just another service shift. This is a black story worth telling. Zariah, a young black waitress with a radiant smile and a posture that hid years of survival, moved like a ghost through the five-star hotel in New Orleans. Her uniform was crisp, her braids perfectly tied back, her skin glowing under the chandelier's soft light. She had served hundreds of these tech world elites before, the kind who snapped their fingers, rolled their eyes, or whispered jokes about diversity hires, as if she were deaf herself. Tonight would be no different, or so she thought. At the center of the crowd stood Magnus Sterling, billionaire CEO of Stratos Tech, his tailored suit, a study in power, his steel-gray gaze scanning the room without ever landing on the staff. Beside him sat his mother, Margot, elegant but clearly isolated, her hands making small movements no one understood. A manager hovered nervously, glancing at Zariah like she was a problem waiting to happen. And then Margot tried to speak. Her lips moved silently, her gestures pleading. The room shifted from polite noise to awkward stillness. No one knew how to answer her. Cameras kept flashing. Champagne glasses clinked. But the deaf woman might as well have been invisible. Until Zariah stepped forward. She knelt, her heart pounding, and let her hands do what her voice could not. American Sign Language flowed from her fingers with the ease of a native speaker. Margot's eyes widened, then filled with joy. Gasps rippled across the lobby. Someone whispered, "Did she just sign?" Another voice hissed, "Who does she think she is?" And in that charged silence, a connection sparked between three people who had never truly seen one another before. This is Hidden Worth, the channel where untold stories like Zariah's come to life. Watch closely, because what happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, privilege, and who gets to be heard. Zariah Monroe's mornings didn't start with alarms or to-do lists. They started with silence, the kind that echoed through the small one-bedroom apartment she shared with memory. A small photo of her grandmother rested beside a half-burnt candle on the kitchen counter, the wick still warm from the night before. That woman, wise and deaf since birth, had raised Zariah with a language most people never even tried to learn, American Sign Language. Every morning, Zariah signed "Good morning, Grandma" into the quiet air, even though no one was there to see it. It was routine, but more than that, it was grounding. Her world was loud in all the wrong ways, and that daily act of remembrance reminded her who she was before the world told her otherwise. The bus ride to the hotel was long, 45 minutes if traffic was light, over an hour if it wasn't. But she used that time to center herself. Some mornings, she read. Other mornings, she just looked out the window, watching the city wake up. New Orleans was beautiful in the way old souls are tired, cracked, but always dancing. She arrived at the Bellevue Regency, through the service entrance, always 10 minutes early. Her uniform was always pressed, shoes spotless, braids tight. The job didn't pay much, $12.50 an hour plus tips, but she treated it like a runway. Because when the world insists you are small, showing up sharp becomes your protest. Inside the hotel, most coworkers liked her well enough. She brought donuts sometimes, filled in when people called out. But even kindness had a ceiling. She noticed how some servers got invited to after-hours drinks, while she was rarely included. And when guests mistook her for housekeeping or asked her to take their coats like she was invisible, she smiled, but it chipped away at something inside. Still, she endured, because Zariah had dreams, not the vague kind, but plans with spreadsheets, vision boards, and post-it notes. She wanted to open a cafe, quiet, inclusive, where people who signed didn't have to repeat themselves or point at menus. A place where being different wasn't something to work around, but something to celebrate. Every tip she saved, every rude comment she swallowed, every tray she carried like it weighed nothing. It all led back to that dream, because Zariah Monroe wasn't just surviving. She was building something the world couldn't see yet, something rooted in grace, grounded in truth. The Bellevue Regency had never looked so polished. Every inch of the grand ballroom sparkled under chandeliers the size of minivans. Red velvet drapes framed the towering windows, and the scent of imported white roses clung to the air like expensive perfume. It was gala night, the kind that made headlines in local business columns and got reposted by tech influencers chasing clout. Stratos Tech was hosting its annual Innovation and Inclusion Summit. Ironically, of course, the room was packed with investors, media moguls, and tech visionaries who wore $1,000 suits but couldn't hold a 5-minute conversation without checking their watches. Every conversation buzzed with AI this, blockchain that, and how the future belonged to disruptors. Zariah moved quietly between the clusters of guests, balancing trays like a magician, champagne flutes that cost more than her rent, and tiny hors d'oeuvres that looked like edible jewelry. She was invisible, which was fine. Invisible meant less trouble. That night, the elite were dressed like aspiration. The men wore slick tuxedos and watched each other's status like hawks. The women floated through the room in gowns stitched with names only the front row at Fashion Week could pronounce. But beneath the glitter, the air was thick with something else: competition. Everyone was either selling an image or protecting one. Zariah recognized the types. She had served them for 3 years now. The ones who said, "Thank you," without looking up. The ones who asked her where she was from, then followed up with, "No, but where are you really from?" The ones who whispered, "She's pretty for a," and let the rest of the sentence hang like a loaded gun. And then there was him, Magnus Sterling. The man behind Stratos Tech stood like a statue at the center of the storm. Tall, composed, eyes like cold steel, and a jawline that looked carved by algorithms. He rarely smiled. He didn't need to. Everyone came to him. His company had just closed a $20 billion merger, and tonight was less about celebration and more about solidifying dominance. Beside him was his mother, Margot, delicate, elegant, and somehow more commanding without ever speaking a word. She sat in her wheelchair quietly, her eyes scanning the room with patience and curiosity. Every now and then, her hands moved gently in the air, signing words no one else seemed to understand. People nodded politely, avoided eye contact, and kept moving. Because in this room full of people who claimed to be building the future, not one of them had the language to speak to her. But someone else did. And she was holding a tray of shrimp cocktails by the back wall. Zariah noticed her before anyone else did. Margot Sterling sat quietly near the stage, hands folded over a velvet clutch, her pearl earrings catching the chandelier's light every time she turned her head. Most people barely acknowledged her. A few offered smiles too tight to be real. But when Margot raised her hands to speak, to sign, no one answered. At first, Zariah hesitated. She watched from across the room, balancing a tray of empty glasses. Her instincts told her to keep moving, stay invisible. Do the job, get through the night, and get out. But the way Margot's hands moved, graceful, urgent, unheard, stirred something deeper. Zariah hadn't seen ASL used like that in public in years. Her grandmother used to say sign language was music without sound. And Margot, in that moment, was playing a song no one could hear. The manager noticed too, except he panicked. He leaned down, too loud and too close, shouting at Margot like volume could replace understanding. Guests nearby grew uncomfortable, shifting in their designer shoes. One man laughed nervously. Another checked his watch. Zariah couldn't take it anymore. She stepped forward, tray tucked neatly under one arm. She knelt beside Margot with calm precision and began to sign. Smooth, confident, intentional. Her fingers danced through the air with fluency and heart. Margot froze, her eyes widened in disbelief. And then, relief. Her lips parted in a silent laugh, hands flying with renewed energy as she signed back rapidly. Years of isolation peeled away in seconds. The entire room paused. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Glasses stopped clinking. A woman near the bar tilted her head and whispered, "Is she signing?" Another said, "She works here?" Magnus Sterling turned toward the commotion. His expression didn't change much, but his eyes did. Focused, sharp, watching. Zariah stayed poised, her hands translating Margot's story as if it were her own. In that quiet moment between them, they shared something deeper than language. It was belonging. No microphone, no applause, just two women, generations apart, one black, one white, bridging a world others chose to ignore. And in that unexpected intersection of elegance and empathy, Zariah became the loudest voice in the room. By morning, Zariah Monroe's face was all over the internet. Someone had recorded the moment she signed with Margot Sterling. The 30-second clip showed a black waitress kneeling beside a billionaire's mother, their hands moving in quiet rhythm while the room stood frozen. It was raw, it was real, and it was viral. On Twitter, the clip was shared with the caption, "This is what dignity looks like." On TikTok, someone added emotional piano music and called it, "the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Instagram flooded with praise. More Zariahs in this world, please. But inside the Bellevue Regency, it was a very different story. Zariah was called into the manager's office before her shift even started. He didn't look up from his desk. He just sighed, rubbed his temple, and said, "We need to talk about boundaries." She stood quietly, confused. "You can't just insert yourself into VIP interactions." That was Mr. Sterling's mother. "It's not your place." Zariah blinked. She was trying to communicate. No one understood her. "I get that," he said quickly. "But this isn't a charity, Zariah. You're here to serve drinks, not play interpreter." There it was, the unspoken rule made loud. Afterward, she returned to the break room in silence. A few coworkers smiled awkwardly. One whispered, "You're famous now." Another looked annoyed and muttered, "Guess we all gotta speak sign language to get noticed." Jealousy crept in, so did judgment. Rumors started. That Zariah had staged the moment. That she was sleeping with someone powerful. That she pulled a stunt for attention. She tried to ignore it, but the weight of invisible eyes followed her through every hallway. The guests treated her differently now, too. Some were overly kind, asking about her gift. Others avoided her altogether, uncomfortable with the spotlight she never asked for. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Strangers sent messages of love and encouragement. Deaf activists reached out, thanking her. Bloggers wanted interviews. TV producers left voicemails. But Zariah just kept working, quietly, with dignity. Because for every message that said, "You inspired me," there was another saying, "Don't get too comfortable." The world had seen her now, but visibility came with a price. And behind every viral moment is a woman holding a tray, just trying to survive the shift. Magnus Sterling wasn't the kind of man who got curious about strangers. His world was spreadsheets, strategy, and stockholder meetings. Empathy wasn't something his boardroom respected, results were. And yet, something about that girl from the gala, the waitress with the calm hands and the fire in her eyes, stuck with him. He couldn't stop replaying the moment. How effortlessly she had communicated with his mother. How she'd bridged a world most people never bothered to notice. And more than that, how she hadn't flinched under a room full of judgment. So, Magnus did what men like him always do when they're intrigued. He ordered a background check. Her name was Zariah Monroe, 24 years old, no criminal record, raised in the 9th Ward of New Orleans, graduated high school at the top of her class. Full ride to MIT, majoring in linguistics and AI interaction. But she dropped out during her sophomore year. The reason? Her grandmother, who raised her, passed away unexpectedly. Zariah left everything behind to come home, took on jobs waitressing, retail, tutoring ASL part-time, and she never went back. Magnus sat in his office overlooking the Mississippi River, staring at her file. On paper, she didn't belong behind a tray. She belonged in a lab, or a boardroom, or anywhere but where the world had forced her to stay. He thought of his mother. How isolated she'd felt at that gala, how she'd lit up when Zariah signed to her. That kind of presence wasn't just rare, it was human gold. Later that afternoon, Magnus picked up his phone. "Find her," he told his assistant. "No press, no cameras, just invite her to lunch." The assistant hesitated. "Lunch? With you?" "Yes, me." It wasn't a power play. It wasn't pity. It was something else: respect. And curiosity. The kind that didn't come from arrogance, but from a man who had everything, except the ability to connect. When Zariah received the invite later that day, She stared at the message like it was a prank. A private lunch with Magnus Sterling. No PR team, no cameras, just him. She almost deleted it. But something in her gut said, go. Because sometimes the most unexpected invitations lead to conversations that change everything. Magnus Sterling wasn't known for being sentimental. In fact, most people in his circle would say he barely noticed anything that wasn't printed in a quarterly earnings report or coded into a product roadmap. But after the gala, something about the young waitress who had spoken to his mother in silence refused to leave his mind. He replayed the moment over in his head. Not the social media clip, he had refused to watch that. But the real thing. The stillness of the room. The way his mother had lit up, hands flying, laughter pouring out of a woman who rarely smiled in public. And the girl Zariah, so composed, so natural. Like she belonged in that space, even though everyone around her made it clear she didn't. And so Magnus did what people like him rarely admit to doing. He Googled her. Zariah Monroe. At first, not much came up. A few viral reposts of the video, a couple of articles that misidentified her as a hotel interpreter. But he dug deeper. Found an old scholarship announcement from a local newspaper in Baton Rouge, top of her class, accepted into MIT at 17, majored in computer science and accessibility design, honors student. But then an abrupt end. No graduation, no senior thesis, no tech startup, just silence. He pulled her student records. Legally questionable, yes, but nothing a billionaire couldn't access in 2 clicks. She had dropped out in her 2nd year. Reason: personal loss. Guardian passed away, no backup plan, financial aid suspended. She disappeared from the system like she had never existed. Magnus stared at the screen, troubled in a way he hadn't been for years. He thought of the countless times he had sat in rooms filled with investors, watching young founders pitch half-baked ideas with full confidence, mostly white, mostly male, mostly connected. And yet here was someone with actual brilliance, living paycheck to paycheck, and holding trays for people who could barely remember her name. She hadn't asked for anything, not attention, not opportunity. She just saw someone in need and answered, with grace and skill. No performance, no agenda, just presence. That, he realized, was rare, maybe rarer than genius. So he made a call, quiet, direct, through hotel HR, requested a lunch meeting with Zariah Monroe. Make sure she knows she's not in trouble, he added. Because this time, he wasn't just curious, he was invested. And whether Zariah realized it or not, her story had just entered a very different room. Not everyone was impressed. When word got out that Magnus Sterling had taken a meeting with a hotel waitress over lunch, no less the boardroom buzzed with questions. His executive team assumed it was a PR cleanup, a feel-good gesture. Something to check off the inclusion checklist and move on. But Magnus had other plans. He brought Zariah's name into the Monday strategy meeting. I want to personally back a new initiative, he said. A community-centered cafe concept built around inclusion, accessibility, and economic mobility. Zariah Monroe would lead it. The room fell quiet. Then came the scoffs, soft but sharp. Carter Voss, the company's chief operating officer, leaned back in his leather chair and folded his arms. He had been with Stratos Tech since the early days. A numbers guy. Efficient, polished, and deeply uncomfortable with disruption, especially when it came in the form of a black woman with no Ivy League connections. Wait, Carter said with a forced chuckle. You want to give a tech company's capital to a barista with a viral moment? She's a former MIT student. Her vision aligns with our mission on inclusive innovation, Magnus replied, his tone flat but firm. Carter smirked. There are 1,000 kids with startup ideas who'd kill for this. And you're betting on someone who didn't even finish school? Magnus didn't flinch. She didn't drop out for lack of skill. She dropped out because life hit her harder than most. But Carter wasn't done. He made calls, reached out to people who might know Zariah's past, tried to dig up anything debt, old relationships, workplace incidents. There was nothing, no scandal, no skeletons. Just resilience. So he did what people in power often do when they can't find dirt. He planted doubt. A memo started circulating internally, questioning the business case for backing a hospitality project under a tech banner. Words like risk and reputation appeared in bold. Quiet whispers spread maybe Zariah was leveraging sympathy. Maybe this wasn't about inclusion. Maybe it was about Magnus. Zariah didn't know the full extent of it yet, but she could feel the shift. Emails stopped coming, calls weren't returned, meetings were postponed. And behind closed doors, Carter Voss pushed hard to make sure the deal never happened. Because for men like him, someone like Zariah didn't belong at the table. Especially not if she pulled out her own chair. Zariah knew something was wrong. The silence wasn't subtle, it was strategic. 1 week ago, Magnus's assistant had emailed her every day. Legal paperwork was moving. A team of designers had started mapping out her cafe's brand. Now? Nothing. Not a single update. Her calls went to voicemail. Her emails sat unanswered. She wasn't naive. She had lived long enough to recognize the moment when excitement turned into avoidance. She didn't have to guess who was behind it either. Word had reached her through a sympathetic HR contact. Carter Voss was blocking her deal. Quietly, calculated, the kind of resistance that never shows up in headlines but kills dreams all the same. Zariah had a choice. She could walk away, say thank you for the opportunity, and fade into the background like the world expected her to. Or she could speak. She chose the second. 2 days later, standing behind a podium at a local community center, Zariah called her own press conference. No glam squad, no publicist. Just her, a borrowed blazer, and a voice the world hadn't truly heard yet. She didn't beg. She didn't rant. She told the truth. She spoke of her journey, how she learned ASL to communicate with her grandmother, how she'd gotten into MIT and dropped out after losing her only family, how she'd worked 3 jobs just to stay afloat, and how one moment of kindness had turned her into a symbol one people praised online but doubted behind closed doors. "I don't want pity," she said, her voice steady. "I want space. I want the same room to build that so many others walk into without question. I want to create something not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been told they don't fit the mold." The speech hit a nerve. Within hours, clips were trending. The hashtag number "Let Zariah Build" began to circulate. Influencers picked it up. Deaf communities, Black entrepreneurs, and tech leaders across the country began chiming in. And then came the game changer. Margot Sterling, yes. Magnus's mother posted a video in sign language, translated with captions, standing beside Zariah's speech. "She gave me a voice that night. Now, I will help her keep hers." That same afternoon, Magnus released a statement publicly affirming his support and calling for radical inclusion in leadership and investment. 2 board members resigned. Carter Voss was quietly removed from his position. Zariah's vision wasn't just back on track. It had become a movement. The sign above the door read "Hands of Grace." Painted in soft gold letters against a deep navy background, it shimmered under the morning sun like a quiet promise. The old corner building in Treme, once boarded up and forgotten, had been transformed. The windows were wide and clean, framed by fresh flowers in hanging baskets. Inside, the scent of warm cornbread and brewed chicory coffee drifted through the air, wrapping around the early crowd like a welcome hug. Opening day had arrived. Zariah stood inside, adjusting a small photo on the wall. It was her grandmother, seated at the kitchen table, hands mid-sign, smiling in that quiet, knowing way. Below the photo was a plaque. "The woman who taught me to speak without sound." Every table had a card with ASL basics, greetings, menu items, simple expressions like "thank you" and "have a good day." The walls were painted in rich earth tones, decorated with local art from deaf creators and Black artists. A small stage in the back corner was set for live performances and open mic nights. The space was more than beautiful. It felt intentional. Her staff moved through the cafe in custom aprons, signing as they worked. Some were deaf, some hearing, all trained in ASL. The kitchen crew, the baristas, the servers, they were the dream. Zariah once scribbled on the back of a bus transfer. Now, they were real, breathing, thriving. At 10 sharp, the doors opened. Families came first, then students, local artists, community leaders, reporters, bloggers, a camera crew from a daytime talk show. And then, through the soft rush of noise and laughter, Zariah saw two familiar faces enter: Magnus and Margot Sterling. Margot signed to her before she reached the counter. "Proud of you." Zariah smiled, tears pressing at the corners of her eyes. Magnus handed her a card. Inside was a single sentence: "Consider this your Series A. No logo, no contract, just support." By noon, the cafe was standing room only. Zariah worked the floor like a conductor, signing with guests, wiping down tables, answering questions, thanking strangers. She was exhausted, but it was the kind of tired that fills your soul, not drains it. And as the sun dipped low over New Orleans, music filled the cafe, laughter spilled into the street, and Zariah Monroe stood at the center of it all, not as a symbol, not as a story, but as a woman who had built something that could never be ignored again. It didn't happen in a flash. There was no dramatic kiss in the rain, no viral photo, no breaking news segment announcing their love. The romance between Zariah and Magnus unfolded quietly, like a song that took its time to find the chorus. After the cafe opened, their worlds didn't suddenly merge into one. Zariah was still Zariah, fiercely focused, grounded, juggling invoices and mop buckets in the same hour. And Magnus was still running a company worth billions, surrounded by layers of security, lawyers, and shareholders watching his every move. But every Thursday afternoon, he came. Same table by the window, same order, no entourage, no laptop, just Magnus, in sneakers and a gray pullover, watching the space Zariah had created thrive. He never asked for special treatment, never tried to impress anyone. He was just there. And over time, she noticed the small things. How he learned to sign "Good morning" without being asked. How he'd wait until after the lunch rush just so she'd have time to sit with him for 5 minutes. How he remembered her grandmother's name, and once left a bouquet of calla lilies beside her photo on the cafe wall. It wasn't grand gestures. It was consistency. One night, after closing, Zariah found him sweeping the back patio. "You know we have staff for that, right?" she said, teasing. He shrugged. "I like being useful." She smiled. "You already are, just by showing up." And that's what he kept doing. They began taking walks after hours, down quiet side streets, by the river, through city parks where no one knew who they were. They talked about music and books and their wildly different childhoods. She taught him how to slow down. He reminded her it was okay to dream bigger. Still, they kept it between them. Not because they were ashamed, but because real things grow better in private. They knew what the world would say, that she was a symbol, and he was her sponsor, that it was about power, or guilt, or optics. But what they had wasn't built on noise. It was built on eye contact across a crowded room, on silence that felt full, on the unspoken understanding between two people who had more in common than anyone would have guessed. Zariah never needed saving. She needed someone who saw her. And Magnus, he didn't fall for a waitress. He fell for a woman who had already built her own empire with her hands, her heart, and no permission from anyone. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Zariah returned to the cemetery. The cafe was closed that day, her one day off, and the city was still waking up. She walked slowly through rows of old headstones, the air warm and thick with early summer heat. A bouquet of lilies in one hand, a folded piece of paper in the other. She stopped in front of a modest gray stone carved with a single name: Naomi Monroe, her grandmother, the woman who raised her, who taught her to listen without ears and speak without sound. Zariah knelt and placed the flowers gently by the grave. Then, she unfolded the paper. It was a letter, one she'd written months ago, but never read out loud. "I did it, Grandma," she whispered. "I built the place we used to dream about on the porch, the cafe where no one has to explain why they sign instead of speak, where being different is the most normal thing in the room." She smiled through tears, then lifted her hands and signed the rest of the letter in the same smooth, loving rhythm she'd used since childhood, just like they used to. A few feet away, Magnus stood back, giving her space. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. This moment wasn't his. It was hers. And he understood that. Later that evening, back at Hands of Grace, The team gathered for their monthly staff meeting. But this one felt different. Zariah stood at the front, not with a clipboard, but with a story. She told them what no headline had captured. How she had once been the invisible girl in the room. How she'd been underestimated, overlooked, talked down to, and passed by. And how she had chosen not once, but over and over again to keep showing up anyway. People will try to define you, she said, by your job, your skin, your silence, your story. But the truth is, they don't get to write your ending. You do. Her staff, some deaf, some black, some both nodded, understanding more than words could say. Because they were all proof of the same truth. Visibility is not a gift, it's a fight. And dignity? That's a choice you make when no one else will give it to you. So what's the legacy? It's not the cafe, or the media attention, or even the quiet romance blooming under the radar. It's the ripple effect. It's the little girl who visits the cafe with her deaf father and signs her order with confidence. It's the young black man who decides to stay in school after hearing her speak. It's the next Zariah who, because of this story, won't have to explain why she belongs in the room. And maybe that's the real point. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show up fully, honestly, without apology, and remind the world that your worth was never hidden. It was just waiting to be seen. If this story made you feel something, pass it on. Someone you know needs to hear it.